In this video, I'll show you how to paint Ushabti, or as he's better known, Commander Farsight, with the brand new model just released by Games Workshop. So sit back, relax, let's get painting. The first thing I've done is primed all of Farsight's body with Mephiston Red primer. Now, you don't have to use it if you haven't got the can, you can just paint it on. And I've left his head separately, and I've painted this with white scar primer, just to make it a little bit easier to paint on later on. The first thing I need to do is paint all of the black elements on Farsight. Now, there are quite a few, such as all those mechanical bits and also the undersuit as well. So if you're not sure, just check the box out. Now, to get this done relatively quickly, I'm using Black Legion contrast paint because this has got fantastic flow and it covers really nicely as well. It doesn't really work like a contrast paint. So I'm just going to go over all the black parts of this. Be as careful as you can, but if you do make any mistakes, you can always paint back over it using Mephiston Red later on. Next up, we'll start to add some of those darker red markings on Farsight, and the colour I'm going to use for this is Vorbak Red. Now, this isn't the best covering paint in the world, and I find it quite gloopy as well, so make sure you give it a really good shake, thin it with a little bit of water, and you probably will need 2 coats just to get this all onto Farsight and covering it really nicely. In terms of the parts we're going to paint, just check the box art, and I'm going to mimic that myself. And one part I want to talk you through a little bit are these lines that Farsight have got down his left thigh. And similarly across the model altogether, there's lots of little lines and set markings. So it's really simple to do, don't overcomplicate it. All you need to do is just paint straight lines. So make sure you brace yourself nicely against the table and just make sure you've got a good point on your brush and your paint is flowing nicely. Paint those straight lines, and if you need to go back in and tidy them up with a little bit of Mephiston Red later on, you certainly can. When it comes to adding some of the detail and the design and angles, again, all I'm going to do is just cut this in with some Mephiston Red, and it should be a really easy, straightforward way of getting some of these markings on Farsight. We'll base all of the silver metallics next. Now, there aren't many, it's really just around that sort, and the colour I'm using is dark aluminium from Vallejo Metal Colour. You can use whatever dark metal colour you've got. If you've got Lead Belcher Citadel, that works absolutely fine. The key is to make sure you've got a really nice smooth coat on here, because we'll be adding some effects later on, and if we do have any little bits of dust and material catching, then that'll show through in the final finish, which we don't really want to have. So just take your time, don't put it on too thickly, and make sure you've got a nice even coat. Next, we'll shade all of Farsight, and the colour we're going to use for this is Nuln Oil. Now, this is the new formula of Nuln Oil, which will run into those recesses a little bit better, and this doesn't get much simpler really. We're just going to cover all of Farsight, making sure that this doesn't pool in those recesses or that we've got too much in one area, because that's going to make it really difficult to clean up. But essentially what we're looking to do is just paint this all over the red, so it'll darken down the Mephiston, and then it'll obviously go into those recesses as well. We can also use this over those silver parts too, and that'll help to shade that a little bit, which will make it easier later on for adding more depth. Once we're happy that Nuln Oil is completely dry, we're then going to start adding some of that bright red colour back in using Mephiston Red, but we're going to use a little bit of a dry brush. Now, we're not going to do this in a traditional dry brush sense, so make sure that your dry brush is slightly damp. Now, I don't mean soaking wet, I just mean a little damp. We're going to pop it in the Mephiston Red, wipe it off as we usually would, and now we're just going to go over those areas. And where we can, we're going to go in a downward motion, because that'll leave the darker colours in the recesses. Now, if you do go over any of the black parts, that's fine, we can tidy them up later. We just want to make sure that we build that red back up. With that red base done, let's highlight all of the black. So the first colour we're going to use is Eshin Grey, which is a really dark grey. It's kind of it's bordering on a light black kind of colour, so it is quite dark, but it does help the transition to the brighter highlights. So we're using the tip of the brush, we're using the shape of the model to drag the brush along. We're not worrying too much about the thickness of this highlight. If it is quite a fat highlight, that's okay, because we're going to really refine it in the next step. So just take your time working your way around. Like I said, there's lots of nice angles on Farsight, so you can rely on those angles to drag the brush and get fairly crisp highlights. Next up, we'll take some Dawnstone and we'll use this again over those areas that we've just highlighted with Eshin Grey. Now, the key here is to make sure you get the Dawnstone inside the Eshin Grey highlight, and we're looking for really fine Dawnstone highlights here, so we don't want to go as thick as we did last time. So it's really important that you don't have too much paint on your brush and you've got a really good point. It's also important that the paint is flowing nicely from your brush as well, and again, just look to catch those sharp edges of the model and work your way around, and you'll get nice crisp highlights with your Dawnstone. If you make any mistakes, if you go over it too thick, don't worry, you can always paint back over it really easily. We're going to highlight all of those darker red areas next, those Vorbak areas, and this is a really simple way of getting those nice and bright and helping them stand out a little bit, otherwise they do fade into the model slightly. So the first thing we're going to do is take some Wazdakka Red. Now Wazdakka Red is a nice desaturated red, and what we're looking to do is exactly the same thing we did with the black highlight, which is catch all the edges of the armour. So again, make sure you've got a good point on your brush and you're just pulling it along those shapes. Take your time. If you need to correct anything, you certainly can. This is a nice easy step. When you've finished all that, we'll move on to Squig Orange. Now with the Squig Orange, we don't quite want to highlight all of the areas we highlighted with the Wazdakka Red in the previous step. What we're looking for here are all those sharp corners and edges that are going to catch the most light. And again, it's the same mantra all the way through. Is a little paint on your brush, a good tip, and then just pull it along the shape of the model. Next up, we'll paint all of those gold gyros. So there's a fair few across Farsight. If you're not sure, just check the box art. But the first step is nice and simple. We just want to take some Retributor Armour and we're going to paint this over all of those gyros. Now, take your time with this. We don't want to spill any on the red because we've kind of got to a point where we're building this up nicely in terms of the layers and the highlights. So it's worth just taking that little bit of extra care, not rushing, just to make sure we keep the gold nice and contained. We'll shade all of that gold using Reikland Fleshshade. Now, this is the old style formula that I'm using here. I do prefer it over the new one, but if you have the new one, that's absolutely fine. You may just need to put a second coat on. And this is really straightforward. All we're doing is painting over all those gold gyros, making sure that the Reikland Fleshshade settles in the recesses. Finally, on the gold, we're going to take some Liberator Gold, and this is going to be the highlight. And really, if we've got parts of these gyros catching a lot of light, then we're going to highlight them all with the Liberator Gold as well. So if you think about the gyro is split into the top half, we're probably going to paint most of that with the Liberator Gold. And then for the bottom half, we're probably just going to edge highlight that, just to give the impression of how light is falling on the model. We'll move on to Farsight's ribbons next, and this is a really nice easy step as well. So the first thing we're going to do is take some Zandri Dust, and we're going to paint this over all of those ribbons. So we've got the one coming from the sword and the one coming from his left leg. Don't forget the one wrapped around his dagger as well. So we're just going to paint this on, make sure that we've got a nice solid colour with the Zandri Dust. Don't put it on too thick, it can be tempting, but this should cover fairly okay with just one coat, but you may need a second in some areas where it might be a little patchy. We'll then highlight that all up using Ushabti Bone. So now the Ushabti Bone, you will need 2, maybe 3 coats, because we do want to thin it down a little bit with some water, and we want to make sure that we're just painting it along those most raised highlighted areas. We're not shading this as we traditionally would, so when it does come to some of those Zandri Dust areas, we just want to feather this Ushabti Bone in, which is why it's important that it's nice and thin, so when it dries it will blend down a little bit. But of course, when it comes to those areas further along that are going to be brighter, we do want a nice, bolder, more even coverage of Ushabti Bone on there. Lastly, we'll take some Screaming Skull and use this just to highlight all of the edges of those ribbons. So this is again another easy step. Make sure you haven't got too much paint on your brush, and just use the shape of the model to drag your brush along, getting a really nice sharp highlight with that Screaming Skull. I'm not really happy with how the Nuln Oil dried on Farsight's sword, so the first thing I'm going to do before I worry about highlighting all that silver metal is I'm going to take some dark aluminium and just paint over where that Nuln Oil has pooled and it's left some tide marks, which I'm not really happy about. And I'm just going to feather this across there, so it does leave a little bit of depth and darkness in the sort of more recessed parts, but in general the blade is going to be much brighter. I'm then going to take some chrome from Vallejo Model A to highlight all of the edges. Now, if you haven't got this, you can use Stormhold Silver from Citadel, any bright silver that you might have. And again, exactly the same as we've done everywhere else, we're just going to make sure we've got a little bit on our brush. We're going to drag that brush along the edges to get us a really nice, crisp, bright highlight. It's time to work on some of the brighter white parts next. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to paint the disc of the shield using Corax White. Now, don't worry too much about the black detail that we've already painted on. We are going to have to go in and paint this again. But essentially, we want to make sure that we've got a nice even coverage of Corax White all over this shield on Farsight. So just take your time with this. Let it dry in between coats so you don't cause any tears or anything. We're also going to paint the design on Farsight's right thigh. But again, all we're going to do is we're going to paint lines. We're going to paint lines with the white paint and making sure we're roughly following the design that is on the box art. We're then going to cut back into it using Mephiston Red just to give us the shape. And again, this is a really straightforward stage. It might seem complicated, but all we're doing is drawing lines and making sure they're close together. When that Corax White is dry on Farsight's shield, we're going to take some Soulblight Grey. We're just going to wash this over, making sure it goes in the recesses around the icon and those letters. We'll also wash Farsight's head with the Soulblight Grey, making sure that it does dry before you move on to the next step. It's also important to make sure this doesn't settle too much on those flat surface panels, which it will tend to do. So pop the Soulblight Grey down, then clean your brush off, and if you need to, you can soak up anything that's pooling, but make sure you do it quickly so it doesn't start to dry and then cause tears in the paint. Next, we'll highlight all of that white. Now, I'm using Bold Titanium White from ProCrill, but you can use any bright white such as White Scar, anything that you've got that you prefer to use. So again, where we can, we're going to use the shape of the model and drag the brush along it, making sure that we haven't got too much paint on the brush. This will give us a nearly crisp, bright white highlight across the head and any other areas on Farsight's body himself that you've decided to paint white. When it comes to the shield, I'm just going to trace around the outline of that shield and make sure that we've got some nice bright white elements on there as well. While I've got that Bold Titanium White out, I'm going to go in and start to base all of the glowing areas. Now, there are quite a few. So we've got Farsight's eye, we've got a little lens on the left side of his chest. We've also got those tower icons. So all we're going to do is make sure that we've got a good steady setup. We're going to paint that white into the recesses. So don't forget, we're going to have things like the plasma pulse rifle, we've got the glowing parts of his sword, we've got the rune on his right hand, and we've also got the glow from his jump packs as well. When that's completely dry, we're going to take some Frostheart contrast paint and simply paint this over all of the parts that we've just painted white. Now obviously we're going to leave the shield and the head, we're not going to paint them, but over all the lenses, the eyes, the tower iconography, the sword, we're going to paint these with that Frostheart. Now we don't want to just leave it on thick, so once we painted it on there, we're then going to just dry our brush off and just soak up some of that Frostheart. So you start to see some of the white underneath coming through, and this is going to give you a really easy and straightforward blue glow effect. We've got some other runes that glow on his sword, and for these we're simply going to use Magos Purple contrast paint in exactly the same way that we used Frostheart in the previous stage. Now, if you haven't got Magos Purple, you can use any purpley pinky red colour that you might have. Just make sure you soak it up so the white underneath does start to show through. So the only thing we've got left to do is Farsight's red armour. So the first thing is make sure that you've covered up any mistakes using Mephiston Red. We're then going to use some Evil Sunz Scarlet, or we're basically just going to edge highlight the life out of Farsight's armour here. So all we want to do is make sure we've got very little on our brush, again a good point, and we're just going to drag it and catch all the sharp edges that we can across the armour. So take your time with this, make sure you're using the tip of your brush. There are some areas, particularly along his thighs and his jump pack, where it's not always obvious that there's a sharp line, so you just may need to take your time and paint this yourself without the aid of the shape of the model. But again, relax into this because this is where the model starts to come together, and it doesn't really matter if this first highlight is a little more chunky than the next one's coming along. The next highlight we're going to use is Wild Rider Red, which is easy for you to say. Now with this, it is an orangey desaturated red, but it does help sell the effect of the highlight on the model, and the key here is to make sure we get it inside that Evil Sunz Scarlet highlight from the previous stage. So we really want to make sure that we haven't got much on our brush at all, and we are really taking our time. Now this took me quite a bit of time in terms of how I painted the entire model, not just the part that I'm filming. And the reason for that is because it's really easy to get carried away and start putting really chunky highlights on with the Wild Rider Red. What we want to do is make sure it's a little more refined, really take our time, and obviously if we do make mistakes we can always paint over it. The last highlight on Farsight's armour is going to be with Fire Dragon Bright, and we want to use this fairly sparingly, so we don't want to go too heavy with it. We just want to catch those sharpest edges and the most raised edges that are going to catch the most light. In terms of how we apply this, again with a little bit of paint on the brush, make sure we catch the shape of the model. But rather than just pulling direct lines, I'm just going to tap the brush a little bit in some areas, because that just will give the impression of a little bit of shine perhaps coming off Farsight's armour, rather than just the solid line highlight that we've put all across the rest of him. So take your time with this. Start off by adding a little bit of Fire Dragon Bright. You can always add more later on, but if you put too much on, it will really push the armour to orange, wherever we want it to register as red to the naked eye. And there we have it, Commander Farsight is done, ready for the tabletop. It does take a little bit of time in terms of getting all those line highlights done, but I really hope you agree that it is worth it. As for adding on some of the iconography and letters across the armour, again this is the same concept that we did all along, and we're looking to just paint lines and join them up. Nothing more complicated than that, and if we need to use the undercolour just to cut in and tidy it up, that's what we've done. I really hope you enjoyed the video. Check out all of my other content. I've got over 200 tutorials on YouTube, and I will see you next time.